Hello. Today I'm going to continue my reviews of Philip K. Dick novels with one of my favorites, 1965's The Penultimate Truth. I included this in my top 15 science fiction and fantasy novels, and for a good reason. I really enjoy it. It's fantastic, it's imaginative, it's very well written, and interesting, and I'm going to go into details of how it was created. Like a number of other Philip K. Dick novels, notably Ubik and The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. This book was based on previous short stories, the first being The Defenders, which appeared in 1953 version of Galaxy Science Fiction. In that story, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a nuclear war, and in order to escape, they've gone down into underground bunkers of both sides, and the war is being fought by robots known as leadys. And when one of the U.S. intelligence officers investigates a leady, he tells him, "Oh, you can't come up. It's still, the surface is still radioactive." This is 8 years after the war began, but they find that he's not radioactive, so they start to become suspicious because this is the second one they've found who isn't radioactive, and so they demand to be taken to the surface. And reluctantly, the leadys let them come up on the surface, and they see it's basically a park. Everything's green. There are animals and farms and valleys and streams, and there's no nuclear damage. And he says, I don't understand it. We were building weapons for you to continue the war. And they said, well, once you guys were down there, we realized there was no more reason to have the war, so we stopped it and started rebuilding the Earth. And they trap them on the surface. They won't let the humans go back. They said, whenever you humans got together, you reach a point where you start fighting and start a war, and that's the reason we kept you locked down there. So now that you're on the surface, here's some Soviet people who've come up, and we want you to meet them, and we want you to start learning how to get along with each other. And it won't be easy, but you'll do it. And so that's kind of an interesting story. The next one that it's based on is called The Mold of Yancey from If Science Fiction magazine in August 1953. That is about some agents from Earth are sent to Jupiter's moon Callisto, where there's a colony established, and they're told that there's a kind of a totalitarian government, and they want to investigate. Well, what they find is a rather bland, homogenous society where doesn't appear to be any, conflict, and their lives are led by this rather dull president called John Edward Yancey. And he tells them what TV shows to watch and what clothes they should wear, and what the latest trends in music are, and they just sort of blindly follow him. And they find out that he's actually an artificial construct, and he's basically just a robot who's programmed by these people called Yance Men. And the Yance Men are trying to basically pacify society through the very dull speeches made by this robot who sounds like he's saying things that are substantive, but in fact, they're just nonsense. Apparently, the character of Yancey was based on Dwight David Eisenhower, who Dick did not like. He and his wife voted for his Democratic rival, Adlai Stevenson, and supported him, so they were not big fans of Republicans. The third story was from 1957 in Super Science Fiction Stories called The Unreconstructed M, which is about a person who has to unravel a murder that they think has been faked by using advanced technology. Dick very cleverly and wisely took elements from all those three stories and molded them into The Penultimate Truth, which is written in 1965 and tells the story of principally two men. The first is Joseph Adams, who's a Yance man. And again, there's been a nuclear war, but it was very limited. It only lasted 2 years. And because they had advance notice of it, because it broke out on Mars, they had enough time to, both the U.S. and the Soviets, to dig underground shelters, which they refer to as ant tanks. And that's supposed to mean antiseptic, but it's really more ant-like in ants. And they're sealed off. They're told that there are all these horrible, there's terrible radioactivity. The war's still going on. They have to build leadys to fight the war so that no humans are killed, just robots. But they're shown faked scenes of cities being destroyed and radioactivity They're told that there are these awful biological things like the plagues called, one of them's called the bag plague, where your skin wrinkles up like an old bag and you pop. And the other one's called the stink of shrink, where your head shrinks down to the size of a marble. And other terrible things that are going on the surface, and people need to stay down. But they also need to help keep building these levees to help the war effort, as it were. The first principal main character is Nicholas St. James, is the president of one of these ant tanks called the Tom Mix, and his chief engineer Maurice Souza dies of pancreatitis, and he's very vital to the ant tank. They can't live, they can't sustain their lives down there without him, because all their systems will start to fail. Their air conditioning, their heating, its electricity, etc. And nobody else knows how to do it, although he does have other staff. But they decide that this group gets together and they sort of force the president, Nicholas St. James, by threatening his family with a bomb, that, you're going to go off and find an artificial pancreas so we can revive Maurice Salsa. And they put him in suspended animation. And if they can get him an artificial pancreas, they can revive him. So he reluctantly agrees at gunpoint, basically, to go to the surface. They give him a radiation-proof suit and a homemade laser weapon and a scoop that'll dig out to the surface, and put him up this shaft. They put off the tank's political officer by telling him, oh, you got to come down and see this problem we're having in the electrical section or something, and they distract him long enough for Nicholas St. James to make his way to the surface. The other main character is a Yance man named Joseph Adams, and the truth that he knows is that the war did take place, but it only lasted 2 years. And after that, the WestDem, which is the Western democracies, and PAC-PEEP, which is obviously the Soviet Union and China and Cuba, all the communist countries, reached a peace agreement. And the few people who are left above are all the descendants, interestingly enough, of an Air Force academy that was in Estes, Colorado, and they've become Yance men. And this time, the president is called Talbot Yancey, and again, he's just really he's not even a full robot. He's just a metal construct chained to a desk, who has an American flag behind him, and the Yance men program speeches for him to make to the tankers, as they call them, to inspire them to build more levees and to show them these fake scenes of destruction, which are really filmed in Moscow by a guy named Eisenblut, who creates models and sometimes full-scale representations of the cities that they're going to show being destroyed, but of course it's all fake. The Yance men know this. They all live on huge, like, statewide domains that are basically a giant park. There are no animals left. The animals have all been killed. But other than that, it's a very verdant earth, although there is a permanent haze in the atmosphere caused by the atomic explosions, and there's no blue sky anymore. The sky is kind of permanently gray. But Joseph Adams is one of these Yance men. He lives in what was San Francisco, and he doesn't like his job. He has to create a speech for Talbot Yancey on a device called a rhetorizer, which he'll feed in a couple of words, and it gives him a kind of a bland speech. Like, this word he has to use in the beginning is squirrel, and it's this thing like, the squirrel's a wise old creature, and he stores up his nuts. He says, oh God, that's awful. And he turns it off, and he's having an argument with his girlfriend Colleen about what he should do, and she says, you should write it yourself. Forget using the machine. You write it with pen and ink. And he has a pen, but he doesn't have any paper. He has to get some from the Yance man who lives like 45 miles away, which is the closest one to him. And he decides he's going to do it. He goes to the Yance men agency in New York, which is located, this is kind of an in-joke by Philip K. Dick, at 580 Madison Avenue, which was the address of his literary agent, Scott Meredith. And I believe until it collapsed in I think the mid-90s, that's where it still was. Meanwhile, he goes to New York he's going to put this speech on a computer called Megavac 6, which actually then feeds it to Yancey, and then it's sent down a coaxial cable to the tankers. Nicholas St. James, meanwhile, has tunneled to the surface, and the moment he gets to the surface, he's kind of apprehended by two leadys who are uh, deciding what they're going to do to him. They seal up the tunnel behind him. He has a primitive laser weapon, and he fires at one of them, which only damages its communication unit. It doesn't really harm it very much, because these are apparently veteran combat leadys that actually fought in the war. And they say he sees that they say on them in English, property of David Lantano, if found, please return and no questions will be asked. And that kind of throws him for a bit, because he doesn't expect them to be, identified with a specific person. They are having an argument whether, what they should do with him. They strip off all of his clothing and his protective gear and take everything he's got on him. And they're deciding whether they want to kill him or not. And they try to contact David Lantano, who's another Yance man. And they can't find him because he's at the Yance agency in New York. And so they just decide on their own that they're going to kill him. And all of a sudden, they're destroyed. They just disintegrate in front of Nicholas St. James's eyes, and he doesn't understand what's going on. And he sees somebody standing behind a rock, tells him, go to Cheyenne. You'll find other tankers who come up, and they'll help you. He says, well, can't I see your face? Can't you show yourself to me? And the guy says, well, do you have to see me? And he says, I'd like to. And the person who steps out from behind the rock is apparently Talbot Yancey. He looks exactly like him. And needless to say, St. James is taken aback. But he decides to go north, as the guy says, and meet up with these other ex-tankers. Meanwhile, in New York, Joseph Adams is getting ready to vac, as for his speech, to the Megavac 6 to hear how it sounds from the Yancey robot. And he runs into David Lantano, and here's a part of the speech that he's writing, which is so much better than the one that he had even handwritten, that he's completely discouraged. He doesn't want to do it anymore. And he describes it as he feels like the San Francisco fog is actually creeping inside him. It's in him, not outside. And he goes to kind of complain about this to the, what he calls the central monad, which is another intelligent leady, and tells him, well, you should go back to documentaries A and B, and with all respect. This is an interesting point. Documentaries A and B reference two false documentaries that were created by a German filmmaker named Gottlieb Fischer in 1982, and were sent down to the tankers to watch. And there's version A is the version made for West Dem, and version B is made for Pac Peep. And each one contains a flaw. They each contain a lie about certain events in World War II. In the American, the West Dem version, shows a meeting, secret meeting between President Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin at the Yalta Conference, where Roosevelt admits that he's actually a Soviet agent, and he agrees to hold American troops off from taking Berlin, so that the Soviets can do it instead. And the flaw in that document is that Stalin didn't speak any English, so he wouldn't have been able to understand Roosevelt without a translator. The B version for the Russians lies that Hitler flew to Washington, D.C. in 1942 and spoke with Roosevelt and asked him to delay the D-Day landings. In return, he promised to hold back a couple of panzer divisions so that the Americans would appear to win. The problem with that one, the flaw that Fisher built into that one, is he has him travel to meet Roosevelt in a 707 jet. And of course, there were no 707s in World War II. Dick makes kind of a flub here. He says that there were no jets except for a German fighter that never flew. Of course, there were jets. There was, of course, the German Me-262 fighter, which did fly, and the British had the Gloucester Meteor, which flew also, and the Americans had the P-80 Shooting Star, so there were technically three. Actually, there were four. The Germans also had the limited use of the Heinkel HE-162 Volksjäger, which only flew from January 45 until the end of the war in very limited numbers. But anyway, those are the two flaws. One, Stalin didn't speak English, and the other that there were no 707s. But in reviewing those documentaries, Adams realizes that there's absolutely no way that he could ever write anything that was better than what Lentano had written. So he decides he's just not going to bother giving the speech that he wrote to the Megavac 6 to transmit to Yancey. Meanwhile, Nicholas St. James rather has met with some of the other tankers from the Cheyenne area, and they basically tell him the truth about what happened, that the war ended, and they've been waiting 15 years in these ant tanks building these leadys. Then they're not soldiers anymore. They're servants for the Yance men who own these huge statewide properties. They told him about that Yancey's a fake. He said, well, he can't be a fake because he saved my life. And they say, that's impossible. There is no such real person as Talbot Yancey. He's just a robot who's programmed by these people called Yance men through a computer called Megavac 6 and 6V, and he doesn't really exist. But they're telling him that this guy, David Lantano, they said that he's badly radiation burned because he's waiting for his demesne to be legally recognized. And to do that, he has to spend 12 out of every 24 hours at the demesne, which is still radioactive. And they say that, he's terribly burned because of this. Well, Nicholas St. James meets with David Lantano, who comes to visit these people and give them some supplies. And he realizes almost immediately that he's not, yes, he's dark and kind of red colored, but he's not radiation burned. He's a Cheyenne Indian. And he's kind of taken aback by this because there aren't supposed to be any Cheyenne Indians left. They were all killed in the first phase of the war, which took place on Mars, which was where they were relocated. But he knows for a fact, and he notices something odd. David Lantano seems old when he first comes into the shelter, like he's about 40 or 50, and then he seems to shift through time. He seems to get younger, and all of a sudden he's like 20 or 30. And he seems to be going back and forth in kind of a time oscillation, as it were. And that's kind of a clue to some things that are going to come on in the future of the book. He offers to, take Lantano back to his demesne, which is under construction, and he can help look after his wife and his children when he has to be away at the Yancey Agency in New York. He kind of, Nicholas St. James agrees because he doesn't want to stay in this kind of crummy place that the other tankers live, which is just the basement of an old destroyed hotel. So he says, yeah, and he's going to go with him. Meanwhile, in New York, at the Yancey Agency, Adams is summoned by his boss and the head of the Yancey Agency, a very horrible old man named Stanton Brose. Is this big fat guy who keeps himself alive by transplanting artificial organs into himself, and he has put a legal attachment on all artificial organs. Nobody else can get one except him. And he says he wants to use Adams on a special project. And he's cautious about discussing it because he thinks the office might be bugged and that people from an organization called the Webster Foote Limited of London, which is sort of a spy organization, might be listening in. But he tells him anyway that he's got this idea for this special project. And what this project consists of, one of the things that the tankers related to Nicholas St. James is that there's another guy named Louis Runcible who runs this constellation of conapps, condominium apartments, that a lot of ex-tankers are put into. But once you go in, they're very comfortable. They got swimming pools and TV sets and ping pong tables and 3 meals a day and air conditioning and all that, but you can't leave. The reason for that, obviously, is that they don't want the information about what's really going on to get back down to the tankers who haven't come up yet. Stanton Brose is concerned because he thinks somebody's leaking information to the tankers about the truth, that somebody has spliced into the coax and has been sending information down to the tankers that the war is over and that everything is fake. He doesn't know who's doing this, but he suspects it might be Runcible. And what he wants to do and he asks Joseph Adams to help him, is he's going to do a couple of things. He's going to create these fake artifacts that another Yes man named Vern Lindblom, who's a friend of Adams, who creates some of these scenes for these false cities that are destroyed on TV and shown to the tankers, to create these artifacts that make it look like there was a battle between aliens, extraterrestrials, and Cheyenne Indians in like the 15th century on the property that Runcible is starting to dig up for his new constellation of Connaughts. And what he expects Runcible to do is to conceal this information. And that's illegal. And if he can prove that he concealed the information, he could go to this, the main governing body, that's like the Supreme Court, called the Recon Dis-In Council, which is in Mexico City, and it's run by intelligent leadys, and plead with them, hey, he concealed this evidence, and that will not only ruin Runcible, but it will give Stanton Bros all of his property. He'll basically be completely out of business, and therefore, he's going to be, his dark secret's going to be safe. Adams doesn't really want to go along with it, and he's talking behind. Bros is deaf. He never replaced his ears, so he has to lip read. So he turns his back to him, and he asks Vern Lindblom to turn his back. He says, I don't know about this. I don't really want to do this. I think it's immoral, and, we really shouldn't be doing this. Well, Lindblom doesn't agree. Lindblom is very pro-Yansman and pro-Bros, and he wants to go ahead and do it. And what Adams is supposed to do, he's supposed to fake a couple of articles for a magazine called Natural World that will corroborate the discovery of these, or the existence, rather, of these artifacts that are going to be dug up. And Bros has an agent named Robert Higg on Runcible's staff who's going to discover them and order the digging to stop. And that way they can prove that Runcible knew about them, and when he goes to conceal them, they can say, well, we've got these audio recordings and video recordings that show that he knew they were there. Adams, again, reluctantly decides to go along with this plan, and they start putting it in process. Meanwhile, on David Lantano's reservation, again, Nicholas St. James has started noticing some peculiar things, particularly about this sort of odd time shift that Lantano seems to go through every few hours or so, and he can't quite understand it. And he also can't quite understand why he looks like Talbot Yancey. In his older phase, when he's about 65, he looks like Talbot Yancey. When he's younger, he doesn't. And it's eventually revealed, and again, I'm not going to tell you the whole novel, but it's eventually revealed that what happened, they're going to take these artifacts back in time through a device called an advanced weapon, basically, called a time scoop, and they're going to deposit them in the soil 600 years earlier, so that they will have aged appropriately by the time Robert Higg discovers them. Some things go wrong, and again, I'm not going to tell you exactly what, but things don't go as planned. And it's revealed in a very kind of a interesting way, partly by Lantano himself as kind of a confession. When they did this, when they sent the time scoop back, he was actually a full-blooded Cherokee Indian in 1420. And he and his tribe discovered the engineers who were planting, the geologists who were planting this false evidence. And so they know about it. And somehow David Lantano, gained control of this time scoop, and he used it to go up into 1982 and introduce himself as an actor in one of Gottlieb Fischer's documentaries. He played General Dwight David Eisenhower in a scene where they're planning the D-Day invasion, and they're trying to stall it by a couple of days. This put his face before Gottlieb Fischer, who got the idea of creating this false president, Talbot Yancey, from watching David Lantano. And that's why he looks like him, because it is him. And so later it's revealed that Gottlieb Fisher was killed on a mission to Venus when mysteriously he fires his retro rockets on his ship and the ship exploded. And it's hinted that maybe Stanton Bros did that on purpose to get rid of him. Members of this special project start to die, and Joseph Adams starts becoming concerned that he's next. He goes to eventually the Webster Foote Agency and asks for protection, and later runs into David Lantano and is asking him, what he knows about what's going on. And he kind of hems and haws, and he doesn't really say very much about what his plans are, but we find those out later, and it's kind of interesting. Ultimately, there's a plot. They conclude that the person who's killing the people on the special project is Stanton Bros himself, and the reason they think that is because Vern Lindeblom is killed by a very strange machine called a Gestaltmacher, which is both a machine that assassinates people, and then it creates false clues to lead to a specific person, including a brain pattern, drops of blood, hair and fiber evidence, a voice print, and fingerprints, and leaves them at the scene. Well, anybody who knows how one of these things operate, and then it melts into an inert state, so you can't open it up. And what it does is it transforms itself into a little portable TV set, but it's much heavier because all the components are inside. And if you tamper with it, it'll self-destruct, basically. So there's no way to really figure out who programmed it except to go by the clues. Well, Webster Foote is called to investigate the death of Lindeblom by he has a death rattle at his neck, which is a wire that snaps. And his leadies think that they've trapped the killer inside because nobody left the house. Well, they don't realize the killer was this machine. And when Foote arrives, he comes to the same conclusion, even though he tries to, ferret out the killer and realizes that there isn't anybody else in the house. And then he sees this TV set, and it twigs in his mind. He's a precog. He has precognition, and he realizes that there's a bigger plot going on here. He decides that he's going to take the brain recording, which is really the only thing that the machine needed to create, to the Megavac 6, or actually to the BB7, the version in Moscow in Max Eisenblut's studio, and find out who did it. It'll pop out a card when it reads all these clues. And it does, and of course the card says Stanton Bros is the killer. It turns out that that's not true, and I won't tell you who did it, but you can figure it out by yourself. There are there's a lot of misdirection. There's a lot of sort of red herrings leading you to one direction, and the truth is something else. That's one of the points of this novel is, what's true and what's not true, and can you believe anything the government tells you, which is basically no. Joseph Adams and David Lantano and Webster Foote all meet. They decide that they have to get rid of Stanton Bros, that he's the one who's creating all the problems. David Lantano Webster Foote reveals that he may know where there's a hidden military base that nobody has found, where Nicholas St. James can find the artificial pancreas that he needs to revive Maury Salza, and tells him where it is, and he says, I'll have my own leadies dig it up for you. And then so St. James goes off with them. Webster and David Lantano and Joseph Adams decide Stanton Bros has to be killed, and they're going to use a homeotropic dart, and that's a dart that homes in on a specific person's biofeedback, heart, brain rhythm, that sort of thing. And it's going to be camouflaged into Joseph Adams's office. And when Bros goes into his office to meet with them the next day, it'll kill him. Adams backs out at the last minute. He gets cold feet. He doesn't want to do it. He's afraid that if he does this, it's going to fail, and Bros is going to kill him, or that if it succeeds, Lantano is going to kill him because he knows too much. So he wants to go down to the Tom Mix with Nicholas St. James, even though he'll be deprived of the freedoms that he's known as a Yance man. He'll be forced to live underground in these kind of crummy ant tanks where you got to share a bathroom with like 6 people, and the food is limited, and there's no sunlight, etc. But he figures it's worth it because they'll never come after him down there. So he kind of reluctantly agrees. They find where the leadys had sealed off the entrance, and they cleverly concoct a plug to put in its place so that it will look natural like regular grass. They go down into the Tom mix, and they play along with, being decontaminated. They don't tell anybody that, these plagues are fake, and or anything really about the outer world. Um, Nicholas St. James gives the artificial pancreas, which he found at the military base because of Webster Foote's leadys dug it up for him, to the nurse who he is secretly having an affair with, and she transplants it into Maury Sousa and successfully revives him. Then there's an announcement that, and the people who sent him up were going to blow him up if he didn't go, tell him that the political officer, the Polcom, was quote unquote accidentally killed when he stepped too close to a wire that just happened to be unshielded. He backed into it by mistake, quote unquote. That they've sent off on his behalf to a new one to replace him. There's an announcement by Talbot Yancey, and St. James and Adams, who know the truth, are worried, is this going to be Stanton Bros, or is it going to be David Lantano, who's actually making the speech? So they wait anxiously while in the assembly hall to listen to this speech. And at first, it seems to them it's kind of a canned speech, saying, I know you guys have suffered a lot, and et cetera. And saying, oh no, it's Stanton Bros. He must have somehow killed Lantano and Webster Foote, and he's not going to let them up. But then the speech turns. He says, you've waited for this very important day, and I have important news. The war is over. And although it won't happen immediately, you're going to be able to come back to the surface. And then they realized David Lantano actually won, because that's not something Stanton Bros would want. He didn't want tankers to come up. It's David Lantano who's pro, was for the tankers and for their rights. And so now both, St. James and Adams were very excited. Adams suddenly feels alive again, because now he realizes he's got a new job that he can do if he goes back up. He has to figure out some way to tell people why, when they come up, they're not going to see a radioactively destroyed world. They're going to see basically a huge green park that's tended by leadys and gardeners. And, what are they going to tell them about what happened? And they're starting to concoct, well, we can tell them we had to wait for the radiation level to, die down. One of the last things Adams says, well, I'm sure we can think of something. And Nicholas St. James says to himself, yeah, the only thing is we're not going to let you. He wants to tell them the actual truth. It's a very good novel. It's an exciting read. Some people think that it's incomprehensible. I just don't think they're paying close enough attention. Like they say that they don't know who Lantano is. You're not paying attention. He says who he is in the novel. He tells you how, why the time fluctuations occur and what happened, and how he inserted himself into Gottlieb Fischer's documentaries, and that's how Fischer got the idea to make his image into this fake President Talbot Yancey. So again, if you pay close enough attention, you'll get the point. Again, without having given away everything, there's some definitely interesting twists and turns in it. I think it's very well written. There's some beautiful language in it, and I really enjoy it, and I hope you will too.